Welcome to this journey through one of the most haunting mysteries in rural American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will move you in a way few other accounts can. A tale so deeply buried beneath generations of silence that even speaking its name felt like disturbing the dead. We're about to delve into a mystery that unfolded over 3 decades in the isolated hollows of eastern Kentucky, where one woman defied all understanding of human nature and left a legacy so dark that entire communities chose to forget rather than remember. A woman who was trusted, revered even, who held the first breath of life in her weathered hands, and perhaps the last. It was the year 1923. The Roaring Twenties were transforming American cities with jazz, speakeasies, and the promise of modernity. But in the mountains of Kentucky, in places where the outside world seemed to exist in another dimension entirely, life moved to an older, slower rhythm. There, in counties where roads were little more than mud tracks, and the nearest doctor might be 30 miles of impossible terrain away, women still died in childbirth with alarming regularity. Infant mortality was not a statistic. It was an expected tragedy, a dark companion to every pregnancy. In these forgotten hollows, midwives were more than medical practitioners. They were priestesses of life and death, confidantes who knew every family's secrets, the ones who whispered prayers over laboring mothers when the bleeding wouldn't stop. They were the first to hold new life, and often the last to hold what never quite became life at all. This is the story of one such midwife. Her name was Sarah Abigail Kincaid, though most knew her simply as Sister Sarah or Granny Kincaid. And before her story ended, the graves of more than 80 infants would be discovered on her property, tiny bodies wrapped in flour sacks, buried in the red Kentucky clay, their deaths spanning 3 decades of silence. The mountains of eastern Kentucky are older than almost anything else on this continent. The Appalachian range, worn down by time itself, creates a landscape of deep hollers and narrow valleys where settlements grew in isolation, sometimes going generations without meaningful contact with the outside world. In Owsley County, where our story takes root, the terrain was particularly unforgiving. Picture, if you can, a place where the sun reached the valley floor for only a few hours each day, where creeks ran cold and clear but could turn into raging torrents with a single storm, where families lived miles apart, separated by ridges so steep that visiting a neighbor required half a day's journey. The roads, if you could call them, that became impassable rivers of mud from October through April. During those months, communities turned inward, relying entirely on themselves. In 1923, Owsley County had no hospital, no resident physician. The nearest doctor practiced in the county seat of Boonville, but reaching him meant a journey that was often impossible, especially for a woman in the throes of labor. For the scattered families living in places like Black Hawk Holler, Sturgeon Creek, and Devil's Creek, this meant one thing: when a baby was coming, you sent for the midwife. Sarah Abigail Kincaid lived in a cabin on a property locals called the Kincaid Place, situated in a particularly remote section of Devil's Creek. The cabin itself was unremarkable rough, hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that leaned slightly to the left, a porch that sagged in the middle. But the land around it was extensive, nearly 40 acres of forest and cleared fields that her late husband had worked before consumption took him in 1918. Sarah was 50, 2 years old in 1923, though she looked older. The mountains aged people quickly. Her hands were large and strong, scarred from decades of hard work. Her face was weathered like the surrounding hills, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth. Those who remember her describe eyes that were startlingly pale blue, almost colorless, that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She had been delivering babies since she was 16 years old, learning the craft from her own mother and grandmother before her. By the time our story begins, she had attended hundreds of births. Most families in the area had been delivered by her hands or knew someone who had. She was trusted implicitly after all. She had brought their children into the world, had stayed through the long nights when fever threatened, had saved women who would have otherwise bled to death on rough mattresses in those remote cabins. But there was something else about Sister Sarah, something people didn't speak of openly. There were whispers, of course. There always are in small communities. Whispers about babies that didn't survive. About how many infants seemed to die when Sister Sarah attended the birth. About how she always had an explanation cord wrapped around the neck, lungs that wouldn't inflate, hearts that simply never beat properly. In those days, infant mortality was tragically common. Families expected to lose children. It was woven into the fabric of life, a darkness everyone understood but didn't discuss. The mountains had always taken their share. So when Sister Sarah delivered a stillborn baby or an infant that lived only minutes, people mourned but didn't question. After all, babies died. Everyone knew that. And Sister Sarah had delivered so many living, healthy babies. Surely the deaths were just the way of things. The community's trust in her was absolute. When a woman's water broke, when the contractions began their relentless rhythm, families sent their fastest runner to fetch Sister Sarah. She would arrive with her worn leather bag, filled with scissors and thread, herbs and tinctures, clean rags and instruments whose purposes were known only to her. She would take command of the situation with calm authority, sending men out of the room, directing other women, preparing the mother for what was to come. And sometimes she would emerge hours later with a living, squalling infant. And sometimes she would emerge with something wrapped in cloth, something small and still, and would say in her low, steady voice, "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away." It was in the spring of 1930, 14 years into our story, that the first substantial crack appeared in the community's faith. Margaret Ellen Caldwell was 19 years old, pregnant with her first child and terrified. She lived with her husband Thomas in a cabin near Sturgeon Creek, about 3 miles from the Kincaid place. When her labor began on a warm April evening, Thomas ran through the darkening woods to fetch Sister Sarah, as generations had done before him. Sarah arrived within the hour, as she always did. She examined Margaret with those large, capable hands and pronounced that the birth would be straightforward. Margaret's mother, Ruth, was present, as was Thomas's sister, Elizabeth. The 3 women settled in for what they expected would be a long night. What happened in those hours is known only through their testimonies, given years later, their words preserved in court documents that gather dust in the Owsley County archives. According to Ruth Caldwell, the labor progressed normally at first. Margaret's contractions were strong and regular. Sister Sarah administered her usual herbs, a tea made from what she called birthing plants, which she claimed would ease the pain and strengthen the contractions. But then, Ruth testified, something changed. Margaret became drowsy, unusually so for a woman in active labor. Her responses grew sluggish. When Ruth questioned this, Sister Sarah assured her it was normal, that the herbs helped women relax between contractions. Elizabeth, Thomas's sister, later stated she felt uneasy, but didn't question Sister Sarah's authority. After all, who was she to challenge a woman who had delivered hundreds of babies? Near midnight, Sister Sarah sent both women from the room, claiming she needed to examine Margaret privately. This was not unusual. Modesty was valued, even in childbirth. Ruth and Elizabeth waited outside the closed door, hearing Margaret's moans growing weaker rather than stronger. When Sister Sarah finally called them back in, nearly an hour had passed. Margaret lay pale and exhausted on the bed, and in Sister Sarah's arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a flour sack. The baby never drew breath. Sister Sarah said, her voice flat and final, "Sometimes the Lord has other plans." Ruth Caldwell pushed past her to see the infant. What she saw would haunt her testimony years later. The baby, a girl, appeared perfectly formed, pink skin, not the blue-gray of a stillborn. Ruth, who had buried 3 of her own children in infancy, knew what a dead baby looked like. "This didn't look like death. Let me hold her," Ruth demanded. "Best not to," Sister Sarah replied, already moving toward the door with her bundle. "Makes the grief harder. I'll see to the burial, as I always do." "No." Ruth's voice was sharp. "That's my grandchild. We'll bury her proper in the family plot." The tension in that room, according to later testimonies, was electric. Sister Sarah stood in the doorway, the bundle in her arms, and for a long moment no one moved. Then Sarah's pale eyes fixed on Ruth. The baby was malformed. Sarah said quietly, "Born wrong inside. You don't want to see. Trust me in this. I've seen it before. It's kinder to remember her as she might have been." Something in her voice, authority, perhaps, or something else, made Ruth hesitate. And in that hesitation, Sister Sarah was gone, out the door and into the darkness, moving with surprising speed for a woman of 66 years. The baby was buried somewhere on the Kincaid place, Sarah told them the next day. She had said prayers over the tiny grave, had marked it in her own way. The Caldwells were never told exactly where. Margaret Caldwell fell into a deep melancholy after that birth. She would recover physically, but she was never quite the same. She insisted, in whispered conversations with her mother, that she had felt the baby move inside her right until the end, that she had heard, just for a moment, a small cry. But her memories were confused, clouded by the herbs and the exhaustion and the grief. No one quite believed her. Ruth Caldwell, however, never forgot, and she began to listen more carefully to the stories other women told. By 1937, Sarah Kincaid had been delivering babies for 35 years. Ruth began doing something no one had done before. She began counting. She went from cabin to cabin, talking to other mothers, other grandmothers. She asked careful questions. How many births had Sister Sarah attended for your family? How many babies survived? The pattern she uncovered was disturbing. While most families had lost at least one infant, this was expected, normal even. Certain families had lost multiple babies, all delivered by Sister Sarah. The Morrison family had buried 4 infants over 12 years. The Whittaker family, 3. The Combs family, 5. When Ruth mentioned this to her neighbors, she was met with defensiveness. Grief makes people say strange things, they told her. Sister Sarah had also delivered healthy babies for all those families. The Morrisons had 3 living children. The Whittakers had 2. Surely it was just the way of the mountains, the darkness that took some and spared others. But Ruth couldn't let it go. There was something in the way Sister Sarah had held that bundle, something in the speed with which she disappeared into the night. Something wrong. She began to notice other things. Sister Sarah always took the stillborn babies herself, always insisted on burying them on her own property. She claimed it was out of kindness, to spare families the burden. She said she had a special plot, blessed ground, where all the little ones she'd lost were laid to rest together. Most families, devastated by grief and exhausted from the trauma of birth, accepted this. It was one less burden to bear. But some families, like the Caldwells, wanted their babies buried in family plots, and when they insisted, Sister Sarah became defensive, evasive. She spoke of malformations too disturbing to see, of diseases that required immediate burial, of old mountain customs that demanded certain protocols be followed. More often than not, her authority and the family's own grief won out. The babies disappeared into the woods with Sister Sarah, and that was the end of it. The investigation that would finally uncover the truth didn't begin until 1940, 5 years after our story opened, and 11 years after Ruth Caldwell first began asking her uncomfortable questions. The catalyst was unexpected: a property survey. The Kincaid place was being surveyed for a potential sale. Sister Sarah was 7 years old now, still living in her cabin, though she had stopped attending births 3 years earlier, claiming her hands were too unsteady, her eyes too weak. A distant cousin had inherited rights to the property and wanted to sell the timber rights to a logging company out of Lexington. The surveyor, a man named James Pritchard from the county office, arrived with his transit and measuring chains on a cold morning in March. He was mapping the property boundaries, working his way through the woods behind the cabin, when his assistant, a young man named Bobby Cole, called out to him, "Mr. Pritchard, you need to see this." In a clearing about 200 yards behind the cabin, on a slight rise that overlooked the creek, Bobby had discovered what looked like graves. Small graves, dozens of them. They were marked simply, if at all. Some had fieldstones, worn smooth and inscribed with nothing but initials and years. Others had wooden crosses, rotted and falling over. Many had no markers whatsoever, just slight depressions in the earth where the ground had settled over time. James Pritchard stood in that clearing and counted 43 visible graves, all small, all the size of infant burials. He left the property immediately and drove to Boonville to speak with Sheriff Douglas Hargrove. Sheriff Hargrove was a practical man, not given to flights of imagination. When Pritchard told him about the graves, his first response was reasonable. Kincaid was a midwife for 50 years or more, buried the babies that didn't make it. Sad, but not unusual. 43 babies, Sheriff, Pritchard said, that I could count, and there might be more, places where the ground settled completely. That seemed right to you. It didn't. Not when Hargrove really thought about it. 43 dead infants was a staggering number, even for a midwife practicing for decades in an area with high infant mortality. Hargrove drove out to the Kincaid place that afternoon. He found Sister Sarah on her porch, wrapped in quilts despite the relative warmth of the day. She was smaller than he remembered, shrunken with age, but those pale eyes were still sharp when she looked at him. "Sheriff," she said, as if she'd been expecting him, "Miss Kincaid, I need to ask you about the graves on your property." "The babies," she said simply. "I buried them here, where they could rest peaceful." "How many, Miss Kincaid?" She was quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly in her chair. "I never counted," she finally said. "Didn't seem right, keeping track like they were numbers. Each one was a soul, each one was a loss, but approximately, many, over the years, many." Hargrove felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Miss Kincaid, I'm going to need to bring some people out here. The county medical examiner, maybe some folks from Lexington. Do you understand?" She nodded slowly. "I always knew someone would come eventually," she said. "Secrets don't stay buried forever, not even the little ones." That statement, that single sentence, would echo through the investigation that followed. The exhumation began 2 weeks later. Dr. Robert Franklin, the medical examiner from Lexington, brought a team of assistants and specialists. What they uncovered over the following month would shock even the most hardened professionals. The graves weren't just numerous, they were everywhere. As they carefully excavated the site, they discovered graves beneath graves, bodies buried in layers where the ground had been reused. The initial count of 3 climbed to 60, then 70, then 80. 80 tiny bodies. Some were mere bones, the oldest burials dating back to the early 1920s. Others were more recent, the remains still partially preserved in the cool, acidic soil. Each infant had been wrapped carefully, most in flour sacks, some in pieces of blanket or cloth. Someone had taken the time to wrap them, to treat them with a basic dignity. They weren't discarded. They were buried, but the medical examinations revealed something that changed everything. Dr. Franklin examined every set of remains carefully. Most were too decomposed to determine cause of death with certainty. But 13 of the more recent remains, infants buried in the past 10 to 15 years, showed no signs of the malformations or conditions Sister Sarah had described to families. No spinal deformities, no cleft palates, no hydrocephalus, no club feet. These appeared to be normal, full-term infants. Moreover, Dr. Franklin found something disturbing in 3 cases. Small fractures of the hyoid bone in the neck, a bone so delicate in infants that it often doesn't fully form until later. Childhood. Such fractures in infants can indicate asphyxiation, manual strangulation, suffocation. It wasn't conclusive. The number of cases was small, but combined with the sheer volume of deaths, it was enough to warrant formal charges. On April 15, 1948, Sheriff Hargrove returned to the Kincaid place with a warrant for Sarah Kincaid's arrest. She didn't resist. She was 77 years old, frail, her hands twisted with arthritis. As Hargrove helped her into his car, she said only, "I did what needed doing. They'll understand that, or they won't. Don't matter much now." The trial of Sarah Abigail Kincaid began on August 9, 1948, in the Owsley County Courthouse in Boonville. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, sat on windowsills, crowded the doorways. Half of them had been delivered by Sister Sarah's hands. Many had lost siblings, cousins, or their own children in births she'd attended. The prosecution was led by Commonwealth Attorney Harold Metcalf, a stern man from Lexington who had never set foot in Owsley County before this case. The defense was provided by a local attorney, Samuel Pierce, who looked deeply uncomfortable throughout the proceedings. The evidence was circumstantial but damning: 80 bodies, no birth records for most, no death certificates, just small graves in the woods and families who had trusted Sister Sarah implicitly. The prosecution called witness after witness. Ruth Caldwell, now 64, testified about her granddaughter's death 11 years earlier. Her voice shook as she described the baby that looked too perfect to be stillborn, Sister Sarah's insistence on taking the body, her refusal to let the family see the child properly. "I've seen dead babies, Your Honor," Ruth said, her hands gripping the witness stand. "I've buried 3 of my own, and that baby didn't look dead to me, not when I saw her. But Sister Sarah was so certain, so authoritative. We trusted her. We all trusted her." Thomas Morrison testified about losing 4 children over 12 years, all delivered by Sister Sarah. His wife, he said, had begun refusing to let Sister Sarah attend her births after the 4th death, traveling 30 miles to see a doctor in Hazard instead. Their next 3 children all survived. Coincidence maybe, Morrison said, his voice rough with old grief. But it made us wonder. Elizabeth Whittaker broke down completely on the stand, sobbing as she described the death of her firstborn, a son, in 1932. "She told me he never breathed." Elizabeth wept. "But I heard something. I swear I heard a cry, just a small one, before she took him away. But I was so weak, so confused, I thought maybe I imagined it." The medical examiner, Dr. Franklin, presented his findings with clinical precision. He explained the difficulty of determining cause of death in heavily decomposed remains. He acknowledged that many, perhaps most, of these deaths could have been natural, the tragic but expected result of primitive birth conditions, malnutrition, disease, and genetic factors. But he also presented his findings on the 13 better-preserved remains, the absence of claimed malformations, the suspicious hyoid fractures, the statistical improbability of one midwife being present for 80 infant deaths over 30 years, when other midwives in neighboring counties had far lower mortality rates. In my professional opinion, Dr. Franklin stated, while I cannot prove murder in every case, the pattern suggests deliberate intervention in at least some of these deaths. Whether through direct action or deliberate negligence, I believe multiple infants who could have survived were instead allowed or caused to die. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Sarah Kincaid took the stand. She moved slowly, aided by a cane, and settled into the witness chair with visible effort. Pierce, her attorney, approached her gently. "Miss Kincaid, can you tell the court about your work as a midwife?" Her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly strong. "I delivered babies for 55 years. Hundreds of them. Most lived. Some didn't. That's the way of things. Why did you bury the deceased infants on your property?" "To spare the families. Grieving is hard enough without having to dig a grave for a baby that never drew breath. I had the land. I made a place for them, peaceful and quiet. Thought I was doing it. Kindness. Did you kill any of these infants, Miss Kincaid?" The courtroom held its breath. "No," she said flatly. "I did not." But then Metcalf, the prosecutor, stood for cross-examination. He was not gentle. "Miss Kincaid, do you keep records of the births you attended?" "No, never learned to write much. Couldn't afford school growing up. So there's no way to verify your account of these deaths." "My word is verification. I told the families what happened. That should be enough." "Should it? You told Ruth Caldwell her granddaughter was malformed. Medical examination showed she was not. You told Elizabeth Whittaker her son never breathed. She testified to hearing a cry. You told multiple families their babies had various fatal conditions. Yet the remains show otherwise. How do you explain that?" Sister Sarah's jaw tightened. "Bodies change after death. What you see on bones isn't what was wrong inside. Hearts that don't beat right, lungs that don't inflate, blood that doesn't flow proper. You can't see those things years later. Convenient. It's the truth." Metcalf paused, then asked the question that would become the centerpiece of the trial. "Miss Kincaid, why didn't you call for a doctor when babies appeared to be in distress? When births were going wrong, why didn't you get help?" For the first time, something flickered in those pale eyes. Emotion, perhaps. Or memory. The nearest doctor was hours away. By the time someone ran for help and came back, the situation would have resolved itself one way or another. Either the baby lived or it didn't. A doctor couldn't have changed that. Or perhaps, Metcalf said slowly, you didn't want a doctor there. Didn't want anyone with medical training seeing what you were doing. I saved more lives than I lost. Sister Sarah said, and for the first time her voice rose. I brought hundreds of healthy babies into this world. Hundreds. How many women would have died without me? How many babies would have been born with no one to help at all? I did my best with what I had, with what I knew. I'm not a murderer. I'm a midwife. You're a woman, Metcalf said coldly, who buried 80 infants in her backyard. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found her guilty of manslaughter in the deaths of 13 infants. The ones with the best preserved remains, the ones where Dr. Franklin could provide the most compelling medical evidence. The other 67 deaths remained officially unexplained. statistical shadows in a story with no clear answers. Sarah Abigail Kincaid was sentenced to 20 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. She never served the sentence. 3 days before she was scheduled to be transferred, she died in the county jail. The official cause was heart failure, brought on by the stress of the trial and her advanced age. She was 70, 8 years old. Some said it was mercy. Others said it was justice denied. The Kincaid place stood empty for years after her death. No one wanted to buy property where 80 babies were buried. Eventually, in the mid-1950s, the state purchased the land and turned it into a memorial site. A simple stone marker was placed in the clearing where the graves were found. It reads, "In memory of the lost little ones, let their rest be peaceful." No names. The families never provided names because most of the babies had never been named. They had died too quickly for that final, hopeful gesture. The case of Sister Sarah Kincaid remains one of the most controversial in Kentucky legal history. Because here's what we'll never know with certainty. How many of those 80 infants died naturally? How many were victims of primitive medical conditions, poverty, malnutrition, genetic factors? And how many, if any, were deliberately killed? The evidence suggests that some deaths were unnatural. The hyoid fractures point to suffocation. The pattern of deaths in certain families suggests something beyond random chance. The testimonies of women like Ruth Caldwell and Elizabeth Whittaker describe babies that seemed viable being declared dead with suspicious haste. But the evidence is not overwhelming. It's not conclusive. And that's what makes this story so deeply unsettling. We're left with shadows and suggestions, with patterns that might be meaningful or might be the cruel randomness of life in the Appalachian Mountains in the early 20th century. Some theories have emerged over the years. Some believe Sister Sarah was a serial killer, motivated by a twisted psychology we can only guess at. Perhaps she felt a sense of power over life and death. Perhaps she harbored resentments. She had lost her own first child in infancy, we know, and her husband had died young. Perhaps she developed a conviction that some babies were better off not living, that she was sparing them from lives of poverty and hardship. Others believe something different. They point out that Sister Sarah also delivered hundreds of healthy babies, that she was called to assist in the most difficult births, the ones where death was already likely, that her success rate, when properly contextualized, might not have been unusual for the era and conditions. They suggest she was simply a midwife working in impossible circumstances, and that the 80 graves represent the harsh reality of mountain life, not evidence of murder. There's another theory, whispered but rarely stated openly. Some believe Sister Sarah performed abortions, that desperate women, already burdened with too many children and too little food, came to her seeking help, that some of those infants were born alive but unwanted, and that Sister Sarah provided a service that families needed but could never openly acknowledge, that the deaths were actually requested, paid for even, and that Sister Sarah took all the blame and risked herself to protect the families she served. We'll never know. Sister Sarah took her secrets to her own grave, buried in a small cemetery outside Boonville, far from the Kincaid place and the 80 small graves she left behind. What we do know is this: the case changed how midwifery was regulated in Kentucky. The state began requiring training, licensing, and oversight. Birth records became mandatory. Deaths had to be reported and investigated. The informal, traditional practice of community midwifery began to fade, replaced by hospital births and certified medical professionals. Whether this was progress or the loss of something valuable is debated even now. The mountains lost their midwives, their birth traditions, their connection to an older way of being. But they also gained safety, oversight, and accountability. The story of Sarah Kincaid remains a disturbing reminder that the past is never as simple as we want it to be, that the line between helper and harmer can be impossibly thin, that systems born of necessity can harbor darkness we never intended to create. But questions remain. In that clearing behind the Kincaid place, beneath the memorial stone, rest 80 small bodies. Who were they? What were their stories? Did they die naturally, or were they taken? Were they mourned, or were they secrets their own families wanted buried? To this day, people from Owsley County avoid the old Kincaid place. They say the woods there are too quiet, that birds don't sing in that clearing where the memorial stands. They report feelings of unease, of being watched, of a sadness that seems to seep up from the earth itself. And on still nights, when the mist rises from the creek and drifts through those ancient woods, some people, reliable people, people not given to flights of fancy report, hearing something that stops them in their tracks, the sound of an infant crying, small and distant and impossibly sad, echoing through the darkness where 80 secrets lie buried in the red Kentucky clay. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest mysteries resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the impossible moral complexities of life and death in a forgotten time, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the seriousness and respect they demand. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on where we draw the line between tragedy and crime, between the harsh realities of history and the darkness of human nature. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly past. It lives in the places we avoid, the stories we don't tell, and the graves we discover when we finally dare to look.